I first arrived in Cuba, I was a little anxious as to what I would find and how I would be received as an American. I envisioned a large military presence on the street and anti-American propaganda on the billboards. In fact, for the first few days, I passed myself off as a Canadian to avoid a confrontation. I soon found my worries were unwarranted, as the Cuban people warmly welcome all foreigners, even an imperialist American.
It's a beautiful country, you know, Cuban girls, Cuban people. The Cuban is a very social people.
What attracted you to Havana in the first place? Why did you come?
Well, it's very exciting to come to a communist country. It's mysterious. In the United States, there's kind of a stigma about it, and you hear a lot of things about it, and you kind of want to see for yourself what it's really like. And I must say that it's a lot better than I expected it to be.
What do you think of the Cuban people that you've met so far?
They're unbelievably friendly. They're unbelievably friendly and very helpful, and I feel very safe here. And I've been welcomed with open arms. I've walked into Havana and had people invited me into their apartments.
Do you speak Spanish?
I speak very little, but I haven't had a problem getting around.
How many of the Cuban people speak English enough that you can get by?
I'd say about 5%. It's not like being in Europe where if you travel around, you can easily find somebody to translate or converse in English. Here, unless you're in an American zone or the marina like here, it's very difficult to find somebody that speaks English. I've had people ask me if I speak Russian to try to communicate with me, but I don't speak Russian.
There are still remnants of bitter U.S.-Cuban relations, but these are relics of the past. For most Cubans, a foreign traveler is their contact with the rest of the world. They are eager to invite you into their homes and treat you as family. The Cuban culture differs in many ways from the U.S. This manifests in their values, passions, and in the idiosyncrasies developed to survive in their society. The concept of family, for instance. The Cuban people value the family above all aspects of life. It is common for several generations to live together in one house, collectively finding the means to survive. Yet, infidelity is so widespread within the Cuban culture, especially in men, that monogamy is almost unheard of. Particularly interesting is the body language found on the street.
And I may do like this, you know, and like that, and it's like a communication through the hands. That's what we do, and we feel very comfortable doing it. And that's one of the things that differentiate us from the rest. That we have a lot of movements and mimics and gestures that are typically Cuban. For instance, have you seen anyone doing like this? It deals with ranks, with position, with money and power. That means someone who has power. So that person that's the gesture we make. And also, I've been questioned about this. And it means, well, it's actually a question. It means, what do you mean? What are you trying to tell me? What's your point? What? That's...
Now, see, in the United States, this means steal third base.
Really? Well, here it has nothing to do with baseball, believe me.
There's another one I've seen. I've seen people, when I've been talking to them about the government, go,
well, that's typical. That means simply Fidel Castro. If they are talking about the president and they don't want to mention the name, they simply go like this, and everyone knows whom they are talking about.
Next to their families, the Cubans' greatest passion is for music and dance. It is quite humbling to find yourself on a dance floor in a country where everyone has mastered the exotic steps of salsa and rumba since childhood. The Cuban culture is clearly intertwined with politics. The ideals of the revolution may not burn with the fire they once did in the hearts of the Cuban people, But there exists a solidarity and hope that is alive and breathing. This is especially so in the sentiments for the martyr of the revolution, Che Guevara. His image is everywhere, and every person can passionately recite his gallant and unselfish story to free the Cuban people.
We went to the markets, we went to the art galleries, we've gone to the stalls where the artists are doing their paintings down by the water, and there are many, many pictures of Che. He seems to be quite the hero in Cuba.
Well, he is. He's actually the hero in Latin America and even in Europe, so I've heard. And people who work in those markets, they know that. That's why they have those hats with the star, the lonely star.
I don't see any pictures of Fidel the same way. Do you know why?
Well, that's weird because I've seen pictures of Fidel, not as many as Che, but as with Che. But I've seen some, and I don't know, maybe it's because Che is better seen abroad than Fidel. There is a lot of negative propaganda against Cuba, against current Cuba, and against Fidel Castro.
Maybe Che is better looking than Fidel.
Well, who knows? Who knows? He was actually a very good-looking man. It's true. Although Fidel, in his times, was very good-looking too. But so my mother says.
Oddly enough, he was born in Argentina and was killed in a revolutionary campaign in Bolivia. But nonetheless, he serves as the icon for the revolution and is loved unilaterally. Remnants of Cuba's alliance with the former Soviet Union can be seen in the cars and motorcycles on the street and in the televisions and appliances in the homes. Today, there's little affection between the two countries. The most obvious difference in U.S.-Cuban cultures is the pace of life on the street and the overwhelming feeling of being lost in time. Indicative of most state-controlled societies, no one is in a hurry to do anything. Sometimes, it appears that Cuba has lost technology. I imagine the countryside looked very similar 100 years ago. In the city, the architecture and the old American cars leave you feeling as if you've stepped back in time. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of Cuban culture is inventiveness. Bicycles powered by chainsaw motors, fishing poles fashioned from pop cans. It is difficult to fathom the ingenuity needed to keep some of these old cars running after 40 or 50 years. With the fall of the Soviet Union and consequently the withdrawal of Cuba's economic support, the people of Cuba faced a struggle to survive.
During my stay in Cuba, I keep hearing about the crisis and the special period. Can you tell me what these are?
Special period is a wider term to call the crisis we are suffering since 1990. So it means a complete falling of all our trade, trade with the former socialist countries. So it means a big crisis in the economy of the country, just falling down of everything. I mean, electricity blackouts, so shortage of electricity, shortage of food, shortage of transportation. All this due to, our trade with the former Soviet Union and some other countries, and due to the embargo.
We had a very, very hard time here. Like, for example, now, like, you can go and with your money, with their salary, you can just change and buy, like, soap or, detergent or whatever. Before there wasn't anything.
The special period, is that a government term?
Yeah, it's a government term, but became just part of our life nowadays.
The crisis is like sometimes you cannot get a glass of milk for your children. Sometimes you cannot get the medicine for your fathers. Sometimes you cannot get a bus to go to work.
Is the special period over?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Well, traditionally, the sugar industry was the engine of the Cuban economy. With changes in the economy, government ministers, policymakers, and Cuban economists have acknowledged that now tourism powers our economy and has the largest possibility for growth.
Is the tourist industry growing in Cuba?
Yes, definitely. And I think that it will grow more in the future.
Of the tourists that are coming to Cuba, how many of them are American?
Well, not many. I only see isolated groups of North Americans coming here. Most of the North Americans I've met, well, they've told me that they have to travel through a third country because they are not allowed to come directly from the United States to Cuba because of the embargo. So it's kind of forbidden for them to do that. And I've even heard that if you do it and they catch you, you have to pay a huge amount of money, a fine or something like that.
In 1994, Cuba decriminalized the possession of foreign currency. In fact, the U.S. dollar is now the predominant form of currency in Cuba. Most Cuban citizens work in jobs that are paid in pesos. There are stores that sell food for pesos with a ration card. These stores have limited variety and very small quantities are available.
Give me an idea, if you can, what kind of income a professor in your position makes and how that compares to other professional careers in Cuba.
Well, I can tell you that we make enough to keep body and soul together, and it compares to any other careers. It's more or less the same as a doctor, as a physician.
So you would make about the same as a doctor or a physician in Cuba? How much would that be per month, say, in pesos? Any idea?
Well, it could be over 300 pesos.
Okay, so that would be $15, $20 a month, something like that.
Something like that.
Do your friends envy your position as a tourist guide? Do they want to do something along the same lines?
Kind of. It's not that they envy the fact that I'm a tourist guide. It's just that they would like to earn as much money as I do.
What does the government pay you per month, let's say, for the work that you do?
Well, that depends. Being a newly graduate, they pay me 198 pesos.
So that works out to be, let me think, maybe $10 a month? That'd be about right?
Kind of, but you have to take into account other things.
You get other things?
Yes, because here, medicines and medical attention especially is free, education is free. You have to pay almost nothing for the rent of the house. And there are many, many advantages that you have to take into account when you say, well, we earn only $10.
What kind of tip could you make in a day at being a tourist guide in Cuba?
That depends. That depends. That's everything. It depends on how good tippers my clients are or not. But I can make say, $50 a day.
That's a considerable addition to the income you're getting from the state.
Cuban economists have acknowledged that one of the greatest challenges to the Cuban reform process is precisely the problem of the dollarization of the economy. With the changing of the profile of Cuban foreign relations and the transformation of the economy, a monetary change to U.S. dollars became essential. Parallel to this, there are some negative effects. Not all people in Cuba collect a salary in dollars. The emerging sectors with salaries in dollars are becoming attractive to different professionals. A number of doctors, professors, and some research people have moved into this sector because of the salaries offered there.
In 1995, soon after the dollarization of the economy, the Cuban state permitted the first glimpse of free enterprise. This man has established his own business repairing and refilling disposable lighters. He has taken an empty mosquito repellent can and filled it with pressurized butane, sealed it, and refills disposable lighters for 3 pesos, a little less than 1 cent. Another form of free enterprise is the emergence of farmers' markets. Here, vegetables and meats are available in pesos. The markets provide some variety in the people's diet, but the prices run high. For most Cubans, these markets are still a bit of a luxury.
There have been great changes in the Cuban economy and society since the crisis of 1989. There are Cubans working in their own businesses, fundamentally in businesses related to food. These businesses comprise mainly of farmers markets, food stands, and the restaurants formed within a person's home.
These private restaurants, known as paladars, are permitted to serve only pork and chicken, though shrimp or lobster are commonly available. To limit competition with the state, a paladar is permitted only 12 seats, and their profits are heavily taxed. Much like any other third world nation, Cuba is racked with societal problems, and the Cuban people take little for granted. This is quite visible when walking through the streets of Old Havana. The architecture is spectacular, but many of these buildings are barely standing. It is common to find the edifice of a once grand structure protecting only a pile of rubble. This building should have been condemned a decade ago. But the state is bound economically and must prioritize its reconstruction and housing dilemmas. The infrastructure, especially in Old Havana, is gone. Most of the older buildings have no running water and have been rewired with extension cords out apartment windows. Without running water, these people must carry buckets of water up to their apartments to refill the reservoir, usually a large barrel kept in the bathroom. Most toilets require a bucket full of water to be dumped into the bowl in order to function. The families living in the suburbs and the country live in much better conditions. If they owned homes before the revolution, they remained living there.
Okay, my dear, this is my mother. Okay.
Very nice to meet you.
Blanca.
Yep.
Okay, Douglas, this is my kitchen.
How about electricity? Do you ever have any problems with electricity?
It's normally because we are in a special period now, and we have one day a week that we don't have light normally. For example, 1 or 2 hours a week. This is my bathroom.
Like Old Havana, they still suffer from frequent blackouts, but most of these homes have running water. Though Havana in many ways resembles a slum, the homes and streets are kept exceptionally clean. There is almost no violent crime.
I know that if I was in New York or I was in Detroit, like we're here this afternoon, I wouldn't feel as safe as I do now.
I can imagine that.
Has it always been that way in Cuba?
Well, no. Before the triumph of the revolution, that is on January the 1st, 1959, things were a bit different. The streets were not as safe as they are today. Because, you know, revolutionaries were chased after, and many of them were killed right on the streets. There were bombs and, you know, many actions taking place on the streets, and streets were not as safe as they are right now. That's one of the accomplishments of the revolution. And this is a very, very safe city, very Pacific city. I do not tell you that we don't have delinquency here, but it's not really high. I can, for instance, wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and if I feel like it, I go out at night and I walk up and down Malecon Street and nothing happens to me. And you cannot do that in those cities you mentioned. So I've heard.
The reason there is such order in the street stems from a respect for their community. Crime is controlled by a massive police presence on the street. In Old Havana, there is literally at least one policeman on every corner.
The only problem I've run across is when I meet somebody that's local They want to walk half a block ahead of me because if the police catch them, apparently they can be thrown in jail or can be hassled. They're very afraid to be caught in a car with an American. They're afraid to be seen on the street with an American because I think the officials don't want the locals to know what it's like in America and how easy it is. But the officials do not bother Americans as far as I can see. If you just tell them that you're American, if they stop you on the street and they say there's a problem or something, as soon as you tell them you're an American, they're like, no problema, no problema, go ahead, you know. They're trying to encourage tourism as far as I can see.
Among Cuba's infrastructure problems is transportation. There are less cars on the streets of Cuba than there were in 1959. This stems from economic strife and the fact that special permission from the state is needed to own a car. Most people must depend on bicycles, buses, or hitchhiking for transportation. As you might imagine, these buses are crude, uncomfortable, and undependable. Many of the taxis are pre-1959 American cars, which may be a novelty for us, but are certainly not safe forms of transportation. Another interesting element in Cuban society is the existence of the black market.
Do you see the black market operating in Cuba?
Yes, in some aspects, yes, I do.
What kind of goods are available on the black market in Cuba?
On the black market? Well, for foreigners mainly, cigars, boxes of cigars. But most of the time, those cigar boxes are faked, are counterfeit. So you shouldn't, if you are a tourist, as a tourist, you shouldn't buy those cigar boxes.
Is the black market something that keeps the Cuban economy moving at this point?
Sure. I think so. All over. I think it's like that.
The Cuban people certainly do not enjoy the same civil liberties that are guaranteed to U.S. citizens, but they are allowed freedom of religion. The Cuban people also have the possibility of traveling abroad.
What happens in your country when you decide you want to go visit another one? What's involved?
Well, I'm afraid that it's a little bit difficult to travel because first you must have what we call a letter of invitation. That is, you need to be invited. It's not just that, you know, you wake up one day and you decide that you want to travel to France. It doesn't happen that way. You must be invited. If we are talking about traveling to Spain, for instance, a resident from Spain must invite you, and that costs $150. It's not free. The letter of invitation costs $150. And you also must be authorized to leave the country, but that's not so difficult. That's not the hardest part. The hardest part is to get the money to buy the ticket. If the person that invites you doesn't do it for you, you must have the money to buy the ticket. And of course, you need to have a passport and the visa to travel.
Thrust into the international marketplace, Cuba finds itself struggling to keep up with modern technology.
In Cuba, is it necessary to have permission from the government to own a computer, to operate a computer?
You mean a private one in your house?
Yes.
One sense, you have to have a permission because computers are not sold on stores. So you have to have a special permission to buy one. Then you can use it freely.
How many people that you know that have computers in Cuba have access to what we call the internet?
No, Cuban people, I mean, we are not allowed to have access to internet. Only some special companies, enterprises from the government, controlled by the government.
The healthcare system in Cuba was once the shining light of the state. Today, Cuba's infant mortality rate is still lower than all other Latin American countries, but the crisis has deeply affected Cuba's healthcare. We were not given permission to film in the hospitals or clinics, and it was difficult to obtain an interview with a doctor. But we found a doctor of dentistry from a rural province who granted us an interview.
Very nice to meet you, Carlos.
Okay.
Tell
Tell me about your job here in Bahia Honda.
I am a dentist in the rural zone of Quillones. I work here doing social services in a hospital. Before the crisis, we had more resources and could better treat patients. Now, we've had to reorganize the system after the fall of socialism. Now we are stricter in the use of the health systems. For example, the rationing of medicines. But this does not mean that we are leaving patients without attention. We have found alternatives like natural or traditional medicine, which we know supports modern medicine. This reorganization has had a very positive effect since 1998. And if we consider donations, the situation is still better.
The greatest success of the revolution was the formation of the Cuban educational system. Today, Cuba also leads all Latin American countries with a literacy rate of 95%. Prior to the revolution, most of the rural population had no schools. In 1961, the state adopted a literacy program that sent 250,000 students and teachers into the countryside to teach reading and writing. This program broke many of the barriers between people of the city and the countryside and brought solidarity to the state.
En una tabla de posiciones, ese número, ¿cómo lo haríamos? A ver, ¿quién me dice? ¿Por dónde comenzaríamos? A ver. Por los millares, las decenas, las centenas, las decenas, 1707. ¿Cuántos lugares tiene ese número? 4.
¿Qué quieres ser cuando seas grande?
Bueno, yo quisiera ser, cuando sea grande, un guardia frontera para proteger las costas cubanas e impedir que alguien quiera apoderarse de nuestro terreno, ¿no? Bueno, yo quisiera ser maestra porque así podré educar, enseñar a los alumnos y porque también es una gran profesión.
Yo quisiera ser médico porque es una profesión muy honorable para mí. Curar a las personas de mi país. Y por eso me siento muy orgulloso.
Yo quisiera ser doctora para cuando sea seleccionada para ir a otros países, ayudar a los que lo necesitan y también ayudar a mi país.
How has the school changed since the crisis?
Before the crisis of the 1990s, we had an excess of teaching materials. Now these materials have been reduced, but it has not gotten to the point where this can diminish the result of our educational system. Rather, our personnel have learned to grow and find solutions to these difficulties and are always able to give the children at least the materials necessary for them to learn.
In the back of the school, you have a little shooting range for the children. Is that designed for recreation or to begin their military training?
The children use the shooting range as a form of recreation or sport.
Y te hizo de este pueblo de gratitud, nacieron muchos hombres, igual que tú, no querían que te fueras y son otros desde entonces.
Después de tanto tiempo y tanta tempestad, seguimos para siempre ese camino largo, largo, por donde tú vas, por donde tú vas. El fin del siglo anuncia una vieja verdad, los buenos y los malos tiempos hacen una parte de la realidad, de la realidad.
What does the average Cuban think of the blockade?
So most of the people blame the blockade for lacking a lot of things. So coming from food to medication to transportation. But most of us think that it's a crazy policy, which affects only, common Cuban people and common American people too. Politicians, they live very well. So, but common people are the ones who are damaged and I mean harmful for this kind of policy against our country.
How has the embargo affected your ability to deliver quality health care here in Villa Honda?
Well, we count on very old instruments that are not very sophisticated. For example, my dental chair is very old, the first we received in our province, but it is still working. We recognize that we have some technical difficulties, and the equipment here is not as suitable as we would like. As another example, the electrocardiograph. We don't have it. Also, we don't have an ultrasound, which is very important for pregnant women. The X-ray equipment is not that appropriate, but we are functioning. The patients that need this equipment need to be moved to a second or third level center. However, fuel or petroleum can be difficult to find. Here in this province, there are many limiting details, but we must focus our attention on the big problems that really worry us.
As an ex-diplomat, would you feel that the Cuban government would embrace the end of the embargo?
Certainly, I don't know.
Do you think the Cuban people as a whole are looking forward to the day the embargo goes away?
Yeah, for sure.
Do you and your friends talk about that?
Sure. We talk about it.
Are you anxious to see that happen?
Yes, what is going to happen, really what is going to happen. Because something is what you see, you know? What you read, what you've heard. But actually, you don't know what is going to happen. If it's going to be really good, like everybody's expecting, that I hope, no. But everybody's just expecting. Everybody's wondering how it's going to be.
Do you think the end of the blockade would put an end to the crisis?
Yes, I believe so.
Would the end of the blockade be enough to eliminate what you call the special period?
I don't think so. If the embargo finishes, we have to cultivate land, to change all our technology, our way of living and producing. So it takes a long time. It doesn't mean only the embargo. It means a lot of some other things.
Do you think the Cuban government has or expects to exercise any flexibility to try to bring this to an end?
Flexibility on the Cuban government and flexibility on the American government. I don't expect that.
Do you think the Cuban government has any flexibility at all to maybe try to strike a deal with the United States government to end this thing before too long?
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
No hablo presa. No, I don't. It depends. I don't know. It's just, you know, the term in terms, you know, political terms, the flexibility. It depends on with who. You know, with who they're going to be flexible. I think they should have been flexible in a way in something. But sometimes I think they should be like that in another. You know, it's so difficult. But I think they should be a little more flexible. If you publish this and I go to jail, I'm going to kill you. No.
Pablo, do you think it's unrealistic for the U.S. to insist that assets and property be returned to the Cuban exiles?
It is truly crazy to pretend that property nationalized after the revolution would be simply returned to its original owner once the embargo ends. A friend of mine recently told me of a house next door to his, which has been owned by 3 separate families who have abandoned the home and moved to the United States. All 3 of these families lay claim to this house. Now, when the embargo ends, how do you evict the family that currently lives there and decide who is the lawful owner? Moreover, a solution based on compensation would need to be enacted.
Mirna, let me ask you, if the embargo were lifted, how would it affect Cuba today?
Well, I think that if the embargo was lifted, Cuba would change definitely, and I think that many positive changes would occur. In my opinion, there will be a flood of North American tourists coming to Cuba, and there will be very good for our economy. We definitely need your dollars here, so it's going to be positive.
Do you think if the blockade was lifted that Cuba would be better off?
Of course. It's going to be a little bit complicated for Cuban people. So first, we have to adapt to new situations, new ideas, new people coming to Cuba, new investments. So we are not used to this kind of opening. So it's going to be something really great and strange and complicated.
So do you think the Cuban people as a whole would embrace capitalism if it was offered?
No, I don't think so. Because we are afraid of the capitalism they have in Latin American countries, for instance. The underdeveloped capitalism, not the developed one. And we don't want that. We had that before the revolution, before the triumph of the revolution, and we don't want to go back in history. We don't want to go back in time to those days in which we had a very, very rich class, which was the minority, and most of the people were starving to death on the streets. We don't want that again.
This building houses a Bureau of American Interests in Havana, the current version of the United States Embassy. They and the U.S. State Department refused to speak with us on Cuban foreign policy. The U.S., since 1962, has sanctioned restrictions against trade with Cuba. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, it is criminally unlawful for any person in the U.S., regardless of citizenship, to travel to Cuba and spend money. This is Marina Hemingway, just outside of Havana. Many U.S. yachtsmen arrive here from Florida every year. Most people in the U.S. know that an embargo exists between the U.S. and Cuba, but few know the parameters of the embargo.
Do you have any idea what the penalties are if you get caught traveling to Cuba without the proper permission?
Well, the Coast Guard gave me a sheet before I left about the penalties. I believe it's a $25,000 fine. I'm not quite sure. I know you're not allowed to spend money here. The way you get around that is you're supposed to have somebody here, a foreign national, sponsor you, and they're supposed to be giving you the money to spend here. But as far as I know, the people that have come here and my friends, they spend money pretty freely, and there's no way to really prove whether you've spent money or not.
So when you were coming back from Cuba, you saw 3 Coast Guard cutters, and none of them approached you, none of them stopped to check to ask you what you've been doing or where you've been?
No, didn't radio us, didn't do anything, and we pulled in right across from the Coast Guard station. No problem, and I hear that's pretty common in Key West. Most people don't want to go through the hassle of the paperwork, and they just come right back and forth without a problem. And some people I've heard have come 10 or 12 times without having a problem.
The penalties for trading with Cuba range up to $250,000 in individual fines and $1 million in corporate fines. In addition, there are civil penalties up to $55,000 per violation and prison sentences of up to 10 years. Today, the embargo is economic warfare, namely restricting U.S. tourism and corporate investments which would ensure survival of Cuba's political system. The foreign policy toward Cuba is mainly driven by the powerful Cuban exile community. In 1996, 2 Cessna aircraft containing members of a Cuban exile group were shot down by Cuban MiGs. President Clinton then signed the Helms-Burton Act. It allows U.S. investors to take legal action against foreign companies utilizing U.S. nationalized property in Cuba. It also denies entry into the U.S. of executives from these foreign companies. This law prevents any U.S. president from ending the embargo until a transitional democratic government is in place. This new government cannot include Fidel Castro or his brother Raul. In addition, the Helms-Burton Act requires nationalized property in Cuba be returned or restitution be made. This includes property abandoned by exiles who became U.S. citizens after the revolution. In 1998, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that Cuba no longer poses any national security threat. There are more restrictions on dealing with Cuba than there are on Iraq or North Korea. The United States prides itself on its belief in free trade and civil liberties. Herein lies a contradiction. Cuba wants products and technology from the U.S., but they do not wish to attack us to obtain these items. They wish to trade with us and accept U.S. tourists to improve their livelihoods. They want capitalism, but on their own terms. It is truly refreshing to see a society relatively free of the materialism so often found in capitalistic societies. Here, people mean more than things, a concept seemingly lost in many Western countries.